Your alarm goes off, you hit snooze, you hit it again. You are calculating even now whether you can skip the shower and still make it on time. That calculation is not nothing. It has variables, it has constraints, it has an acceptable margin of error and a threshold below which the output changes. You did all of it in 4 seconds, half asleep, without writing anything down. There is a word for people who do this. Most of us have heard it. And it is not flattering, but here is what the word misses. In 1908, a British Army officer named Sir William Slim watched two types of soldiers move through the same terrain. The ones who worked hardest covered the most ground. The ones who looked for shortcuts arrived first, with energy left over. He wrote about this distinction for the rest of his career, and his conclusion stayed the same. The ones who appeared to be doing less were solving a harder problem. They were not avoiding work. They were avoiding unnecessary work. Those are not the same thing. A person who walks to the kitchen twice when one trip would have done it is not being efficient. A person who sits for 3 minutes figuring out how to do it in one trip has spent mental energy that looks from the outside exactly like doing nothing. The result is one trip. The ledger does not show the 3 minutes. It only shows the trip. This is where the confusion starts, and it runs deeper than most people realize. In the 1950s, psychologist Raymond Cattell at the University of Illinois began separating two things that the word intelligence had been lumping together for decades. One was crystallized intelligence, facts, vocabulary, accumulated knowledge. The other was something different, ability to hold new information in mind, notice patterns that were not there yesterday, and solve problems that have no existing template. He called it fluid intelligence. The tests for crystallized intelligence reward people who have put in the hours. The test for fluid intelligence reward people who find the shortest path through unfamiliar territory. Those two skill sets do not always live in the same person. So the question is not which group is smarter. The question is smarter and what, and that is where the research starts to get uncomfortable. In 2015, a team at Florida Gulf Coast University led by Todd McElroy gave a standard cognitive reflection test to a group of adults. The test measures one specific thing, whether you pause before answering or whether you go with the first response that comes to mind. Then, for a week, they had participants wear an accelerometer on their wrist. Every step counted. Every period of stillness recorded. The high need for cognition scores. The ones whose brains kept working on problems even when they were not required to moved less, not slightly less, substantially less. The researchers were careful not to overclaim, but the pattern was there and it was consistent. People who found thinking rewarding did not fill their unstructured time with movement. They filled it with something that looks from the outside like nothing. It looks like nothing because the output is invisible. A roofer's work product is the roof. An accountant's work product is the document. A person sitting still with their eyes open, reorganizing their model of how something works, produces nothing you can point to, nothing you can weigh, nothing that makes noise or takes up space. That invisibility is the entire problem. Now hold that thought, because there is a counter-argument that needs serious airtime before we go any further. The counter-argument goes like this. Fluid intelligence and physical activity are not actually opposed. Exercise increases blood flow to the prefrontal cortex. It elevates BDNF, a protein involved in forming new neural connections. The research on this is substantial and consistent. John Rady at Harvard Medical School spent years documenting cases where introducing mandatory exercise into school schedules, measurable cognitive gains. The students ran for 20 minutes before class and their test scores went up. That is not a small finding. That is not an outlier. That pattern has been replicated across countries, age groups, and socioeconomic conditions. Movement is not the enemy of thought for many people. Movement is what makes sustained thought possible. So the claim cannot be that lazy people are smarter. The data does not support that. What the data supports is narrower and stranger. People with high fluid intelligence often self-regulate their physical activity downward during periods of intense cognitive engagement. Not because they are avoiding effort, because they are already expending it. The body goes still not from laziness, but from allocation. The resources are occupied elsewhere, The distinction matters enormously, and it is almost never made, because from the outside, a person sitting motionless at a table looks the same whether they are in a state of complete cognitive engagement or complete cognitive vacancy. The posture is identical. The output is identical. 0 and something very large look exactly the same until the product appears. Here is where it becomes personal. You have probably been called lazy at some point, or you have called someone else lazy. Think about what evidence that judgment was based on. Absence of visible motion, absence of completed tasks, a stillness that did not look like work. What that judgment could not access was the inside of the skull. In 2016, researchers of North Carolina asked a different question. Not how active are people who score high on cognitive assessments, but why do less cognitively engaged people tend to fill their time with physical activity? The answer, when they ran the numbers, was not that movement is intrinsically rewarding for those people. The answer was that they find idle time aversive. The absence of stimulation is uncomfortable. Movement is the solution to that discomfort. High need for cognition individuals do not find idle time aversive. They find it useful. The unstructured hour that feels to one person like emptiness to be escaped feels to another person like a workbench. Because if the highly cognitively engaged person values unstructured time as a resource and uses it productively in ways that are invisible, then, over a long enough timeline, the output should be visible. The products should accumulate. The work should show up somewhere, and sometimes it does. There is a consistent pattern in the biographies of people who changed how entire fields worked. Darwin spent years at Downhouse doing what looked like very little. He walked his thinking path. He sat in his study. He wrote letters. He worked, by the standards of a factory floor, an extremely short day. Newton, during the plague years at Woolsthorpe, produced work that would take the rest of science 2 centuries to fully absorb. He did not keep industrial hours. He kept his own hours, which looked from the outside like the hours of a man with nothing pressing to do. This does not mean that walking slowly and staring out windows produces great science. Causation does not run that way. What it means is that the cognitive style that makes certain kinds of problems solvable requires conditions that look from the outside like underperformance, and those conditions are systematically penalized in most institutional environments. The school that grades on homework completion is selecting for a particular kind of engagement. The office that measures productivity by hours at the desk is selecting for a particular kind of visibility. The manager who rewards people who always look busy is, without knowing it, creating an environment where the highest value cognitive work is the riskiest strategy. In that environment, the person who pauses before answering looks uncertain. The person who does not fill every minute looks unreliable. The person who produces nothing visible for 3 days and then produces something that solves a 6-month problem looks, for 3 of those days, exactly like a person who produces nothing. The institution cannot see inside the 3 days. It can only see the absence, and so it trains people to look busy, and people learn to perform productivity rather than produce it, and the actual work migrates to whatever time and space remains after the performance is complete. What gets lost in this is not intelligence. Intelligence does not go away because the environment does not reward it. What gets lost is the willingness to appear idle while the thinking is happening. The person who has been called lazy enough times learns to disguise the thinking. They fill the visible hours with motion and save the actual problem for the walk home, the shower, the half-awake moment before the alarm. You know this moment, you have had it. The answer arrives when you are not trying to find it. You are doing something else, something that looked like nothing, and the thing that had been stuck for a week simply resolved itself. That is not magic. That is the default mode network, a system of regions in the brain that becomes more active when external demands decrease. The brain does not stop working. When you stop directing it, it shifts into a different mode of working, one that is better at connecting distant associations, one that is better at finding solutions that do not follow from the most recent inputs. You cannot force this mode on. You can only stop forcing it off. And the culture that fills every unoccupied moment with a screen, a task, a notification, a meeting, is not increasing the amount of thinking that gets done. It is replacing one kind of thinking with another, the kind that feels productive, the kind that produces output on a schedule, the kind that can be monitored and measured and reported. The other kind does not schedule well. It does not produce on demand. It arrives when the conditions are right, which is to say, when the person has been allowed to sit still and look like they are doing nothing for long enough. This was never a character flaw. It was never a discipline problem. The thinking that happens in apparent stillness is not the symptom of a deficient will. It is a cognitive style that the current environment was not built to accommodate, and so the environment named it something shorter and put it in the failure column. The label is the institution as assessment of the person as behavior. It is not the person as assessment of what is happening inside their own head. And what is happening inside is something the label never looked at. The snooze button calculation runs in 4 seconds. The value of the extra 12 minutes is weighed against the cost of the shower decision and the revised transit margin. And the answer is worth it or not worth it. You do not call that laziness. You call it math. It is always math.